A young person today is subject to infinitely greater volume of stuff and at a greater speed and with a sense of sort of immediacy that I suspect you and I, Lawrence, as we were at school or growing up, had none of that exposure. Now, if you think about just even one simple concept, there is in psychology a very growing awareness that if we are exposed to, let's pick something, violent or graphic content or images, if we're exposed to that, it has the very obvious potential to cause an impact on us.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Finding Equilibrium show. I'm delighted to be here, delighted, of course, that you're here, and delighted that my guest today is Simon Brown-Greaves. And Simon is the Chief Mental Health Officer for Australia Post, a brand that we know very well here in Australia. And he's also an organizational psychologist. So delighted to have you with us today, Simon. I know you've got a super busy schedule. and today you mentioned just before we press record that you're in a very wet Melbourne. So
grey and wet, and it feels like the seasons have changed, and all out there who knows Melbourne absolutely knows that I'm dreaming, because it'll change in about 20 minutes.
So let's jump straight in, Simon. So Chief Mental Health Officer for Australia Post, one of the most iconic brands. So I'd love to know how you came to get in this role, and what has the journey looked like for you?
I've been in the workforce for some time, and I thought one day I'll get to be a Chief Mental Health Officer. Absolutely not. And I started my career as a clinician, as a psychologist. And even if I think back to choice then, we're talking about in the early 70s, and you went through school and basically you went to uni and did the course that you got into. And interestingly enough, I studied science at Melbourne University. So my original degree was a Bachelor of Science. And I will never forget the day that at the in the enrolment process, the person guiding us new students through said, well, you've got to pick 5 first-year subjects, Simon. You've got to have a certain number of points. And however I sliced and diced them, I picked my chemistry, my zoology, my biology, and I was always 4 points short for some reason. And eventually she looked at me and exasperated. She said, look, there's a psychology unit that'll give you 4 points, and it's easy. Won't be any stress, no pressure, just do that. So I took that advice, and here we are, ended up some years later doing psychology as my major, then going on to becoming a clinician. Then if you fast forward, I spent a lot of years on the tools, Lawrence. I worked as a clinician in a number of different settings, including policing, including the correctional environment, before transitioning into the world of business. And that's really where I've been for the last 30 or so years. Stints as a CEO of businesses, and then running my own business for the last 15 years, which I then sold. And I found myself at a bit of a loose end, having sold that business and thinking, what's next? And purely coincidentally, Australia Post were contemplating the idea of a Chief Mental Health Officer role. They approached and asked if I might be interested, and here we are. So I've been doing that job now for a bit over 18 months and loving it. Been a really great choice, no regrets.
Amazing. So mental health seems to become a much bigger focus, and it did. And it's really interesting, you working in this space for 30 years in all those different environments, and actually seeing now where it feels, and I may be completely wrong, but it feels that there's a lot more focus, a lot more resources going into it, but the problem seems to be not getting any better. Am I completely wrong in that assertion?
No, you're absolutely, in my view, I share that view. And in fact, I scratch my head some days about the explosion in both interest and the prevalence. And can I preface one thing about what we're going to talk about? And I know I'm going to say a couple of things. Anything, some of my views at a systemic or strategic level, I have to be really conscious of the fact that also alongside that, there are people who are really struggling with their own mental health, and that is a very real and important consideration. Because I know sometimes I might start, as we start to talk about trends and strategy and all of that, it can sometimes come across as a little depersonalized. But I just want to assure the listeners I remain compassionate. I do not suffer, thankfully, burnout. I remain a person who is vitally interested in both ends of this spectrum. The people who are really wrestling with their mental health and well-being, as well as the questions about what is a good system, what is a good structure, what does a good society look like when it comes to mental health and well-being. So I just wanted to make that point because as we delve into some of the issues about what does good look like, I think that's an important consideration. And yes, any cursory glance at the media or listening to the news or hot subjects in social media, mental health is significantly more prominent now than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So and that has all sorts of implications, and there are many reasons why I say that.
Yeah. And one of the problems that I'm very sensitive to is once things become, let's say become more interesting from a commercial point of view, we start to see a lot of noise. And of course, in some ways that can almost re-emphasize the problem instead of actually making people feel better. So I'd love your view on that, how we navigate as individuals as well as HR professionals and business leaders, how we navigate the plethora of guidance, tools, advice that's coming at us every single day.
And it is every single day, isn't it? I mean, and in my new role, I'm subject to it now. I've gone from being the consultant in the space to owning my organisation's strategy around mental health, and I some days look at it and go, wow, I wonder whether I behaved or approached the whole procurement process like that. So, a couple of things. To cut through all of that stuff and work out what is it that we as an organisation or as an employer should do, need to do, could do, is the starting point. And, thinking also about making sure that an organisation, A, has a plan, and in setting up that plan, it consults appropriately, not only with its workforce, but with trusted advisors in terms of, what it is that we should be doing. That helps you set up a platform and a basis to be able to say, look, thanks for your offer for snake oil substance number 17 that you think might help us. But our plan is more about evidence-based things that are relevant to our organisational environment. So the first part is a really good plan. Second part is let's try and make sure that we're looking at evidence-based solutions. And in practical terms, this is really also about organisations and particularly executive teams having a really good conversation about what is our responsibility. What is it that we do? Because this mental health conversation always has two pathways. Pathway one is you and I, Lawrence, we turn up for work, we bring ourselves, our relationships, our kids, in my case, grandkids now. So we're a human with all of the wonderful idiosyncrasies that we have. And we turn up, we cross the threshold, we enter the workplace. Now, on any given day, depending on how big your workforce is, that could present with issues about mental health, mental illness, family disruption, family violence, any one of a number of potential reasons why people need support, help, or assistance. Then the second pathway is all about, as an employer, what do we ask of our people? What are the things that we want them to do that could in fact contribute to their mental health and well-being in either a good or a bad way? And I happen to sort of be of the view that we need to be clear about what is an individual's responsibility for their own mental health, alongside what is the organisation not only obliged to do, but morally and from a good social contribution, what is it we should do for our people? One simple example, at Australia Post, we ask our people to get out into the community and engage with the public on a daily basis. That carries potential impacts and risks, whether it's dealing with aggression, dealing with unhappy customers. Hopefully for us, not too many of those, but that it is a reality.
It happens, yeah.
So we ask them to do that. So we should, and we do, take seriously how could we support our people to mitigate that risk. On the other hand, as I'm sure you've heard me say before, is it the employer's responsibility to provide yoga classes or free gym membership in the interest of mental health? And let me be clear, those two things for many people are really positive things that make a good contribution to balance. But whose responsibility are those things? I think often as at an organisational level, we get confused about how much of each of those things should be in our strategy.
It's very blurry, isn't it? It's really changed a lot over the last few years. And I guess what I hear, because I see a lot of organizations who are doing some of the tokenistic things, if you like. They're doing yoga classes because they feel that they've got to do something, but there's no
the intent
plan.
is good. The
intent is always
no
good.
Yeah.
And one of the things we often see is that the leaders themselves are struggling with time and prioritization, and therefore this becomes a very low priority. I mean, it's what we're trying to do is highlight the opportunity as opposed to it being another thing at the the end of a long list. But I'm curious to understand, like in your role at Australia Post, how many employees, how many people do you have working for Australia Post?
Well, if you talk about our team members, we probably talk about 60 to 70,000 people who are employed or fully contracted by us. But I would add, and particularly in this mental health conversation, we also offer support and services to family members in a number of our programs. So technically speaking, our coverage or our reach is more like well over 200,000 people. Wow. We're the sort of size of Geelong, aren't we? It's
amazing. You are. It's the size of a town. So.
We are. Yeah.
So that's a massive responsibility. So just the 60 to 70,000, and a lot of your people have a lot of interface with the local communities. So they affect people's days. I know a lot of people who spend a lot of time going to the post office, going to the post office. So I guess I'm curious what you did when you started. So this was a brand new role, Chief Mental Health Officer. You come into this environment with 70,000 people and their families. Massive responsibility, and they're doing all different kinds of roles. How did you start to unravel the challenge?
It was a really interesting process, though, and I would add, I'm very fortunate. One of the reasons a couple of years or so down the track I'm still there is that I am surrounded by leaders who take this very seriously. Australia Post takes its both mental health and wellbeing responsibilities seriously, but also, and a pleasant surprise for me, is very conscious of our role in society more broadly, right? Australia Post is everywhere. We have partnerships, for example, with Beyond Blue that take Beyond Blue's message out into the community. So not only for our people, but for the communities that we serve. So the first thing I did was really sit down with the internal stakeholders in the mental health space and did a review with them of what we currently do, what are the major risks that affect the mental health of our workforce. I did all the expected things. All of our listeners will know a number of the tasks that were part of that. I looked at the data. I looked at our claims. I looked at absenteeism. In particular, Lawrence, I had a really good look, because this was new for me, the demographics and scale of our workforce. We have significant populations of varieties of cultures, languages, and the like. We also are highly multi-ability friendly. And I was pleasantly shocked by the emphasis on inclusion and diversity in our workforce. So I looked at all of those things and then did a bit of a summary and prepared a report for the board that largely gave a bit of a tick to where the organisation had been heading and where it was evolving, added in a few thoughts about next steps and where we might want to continue to focus energies, and that was adopted by the board bit over 12 months ago, and that's our roadmap for the way forward.
Amazing. And that it sounds like you came into an organization where there was an awareness of and lots of policies and lots of tactics in place. And what you've been able to do is bring that together, turn that into a strategy, and then fill in some of the gaps, perhaps, and
It's an
and drive it
unusual,
forward.
spot on. And how unusual that I'm not that politician who comes in and 3 weeks later said, "Oh my God, I was not aware of the mess that I've inherited." No, quite the opposite. I am very favourable and known to be quite thankful to my predecessors who were absolutely on the right path. Our senior leaders were well known more broadly as people who took this seriously. So for me, it was not a revolution. It's an evolutionary process. Now, that is not to say that we don't have many, many challenges and evolving challenges. We're in the middle of a quite significant and very public transformation at the moment. All our listeners would know we don't do letters much anymore. We do a lot of parcels. One of our workforce characteristics, Lawrence, is we've got one of the oldest workforces for a company our size. Our average age of our workers is in the 50s. And so we have all sorts of challenges associated with those demographics as well.
Now, of course, you've got like every challenge going, really, like Malta, and you're overseas as well. A lot of people wouldn't be aware of that.
We are. We've got a chunk of workforce in Jordan,
right?
which I didn't know about, and we've got people all over the place, and it's a wonderful and very, very amazing cross section of folk.
And then when you look like in your role, just to get a sense of how people are feeling, what the mental health issues are, I'm curious, are you taken from one crisis to the next, or do you have resources to focus on preventative measures, well-being measures, which can really support people on a day-to-day basis, dealing with, everyday challenges, customer challenges, anything can happen in an environment that you work in.
I would say we are well placed with a very nice balance between the preventative, the obvious importance of, preventative stuff, whether it's job design or whether it's mitigating risks of critical incidents and the like. That is, a big chunk of our strategy, as well as then being able to respond and support in the moment when inevitably things happen. And then sitting underneath that, of course, is all of the, bringing the whole person to work, which means that we have services every day for people who might be struggling with workload, struggling with family pressures, struggling with financial pressures. And to answer the specific answer to your question is we are a slightly more complicated microcosm of society, aren't we? We have anything that's going on in the broader community, we can reasonably expect to see those challenges and issues. But I do think we're pretty good at understanding prevention is better than cure. And on particularly our business critical risks of the things that that we ask our people to do, I'm seeing a pretty strong focus on how do we engineer out some of that risk, which is nice.
Yeah, no, that's great. Let's kind of move on. I'm curious, when we look at some of the trends, like when you look at, you mentioned the term whole person. And when we look at a whole person, someone who's working for Australia Post, they're of course influenced by their personal life as well as the transformation and the changes and everything that's going on within your organization. How do you cope and manage the influences from social media, for example, on a person's mental health? Because I know myself, I consciously now incredibly discerning. I'm very careful what I look at. I've stopped looking at the news, like all of these things, because my background's marketing. I understand that there is information I need, but there's some information that may not be in my best interest and kind of pushes my mental health lower, on my emotional health. It doesn't help me be more productive, if you like. How do you cope when you've got so many people and social media is such an enormous, in fact, we've both seen the rise of social media from like nothing to like a major influencer in everybody's lives. So I'm curious how you manage that.
It's such a big issue. We talk about it, social media, but it's the broader concept is that a young person today is subject to infinitely greater volume of stuff and at a greater speed and with a sense of sort of immediacy that I suspect you and I, Lawrence, as we were at school or growing up, had none of that exposure. Now, if you think about just even one simple concept, there is in psychology a very growing awareness that if we are exposed to, let's pick something, violent or graphic content or images, if we're exposed to that, it has the very obvious potential to cause an impact on us. Okay, so that underlying proposition, no one argues with that. Now, when I first joined the police force back in the 80s, my chance of being exposed to a serious incident or a photos, I graphically remember going out to the forensic laboratory and looking at the odd photo. And the point is, the odd photo on occasion or the odd incident on occasion. There was no social media. I was not bombarded with these things. Fast forward to now. If anyone on this podcast listening will know, if they have teenagers or young adults, the possibility that they are looking at or being exposed to that type of content on repeat, rinse and repeat, high volumes and high graphic, unconstrained largely, then you don't need to be a scientist or a psychologist to go, wow, I wonder what effect that is having on. Now, that's correlated, Lawrence, with one thing that you and I have talked about. In the broader community, the latest Black Dog and Beyond Blue data tells us that young people's mental health fell off a cliff about 5 or 6 years ago. And that phrase, falling off a cliff, was the phrase used by, recently I saw the chief executive of Black Dog, who is an incredibly articulate and reputable researcher and psychiatrist, and he described young people's mental health as having fallen off a cliff. There's got to be a connection between these things. The balance is out. The balance is wrong. Now, the other thing you mentioned in there too, let's not be all in the doom, because the flip side is that stigma is reducing and we are able to have conversations better now than we perhaps might have in the past. Organisations are better, not perfect, and it is variable, but organisations are better at being able to say, okay, so you're having some mental health concerns, we can support you with that, and it won't necessarily impact on your career, your opportunity, or your ability to be a perfectly contributing member of our workforce. We're getting much better at that. So, that is the other side of this increasing dialogue and focus on mental health.
It comes back, what goes through my mind, it comes back to the point you were discussing before about where the responsibility lies between the person, the employee, and the employer. And what went through my mind is, we know now, and food, for example, is something where the line, I used to run a big wellbeing program myself, and the food was a really hard thing to change because people saw that as their own choice, what they put in their mind, in their body. We know now that hyper-processed food is not necessarily, if you live on that only, that's not going to be great for your physical health or your mental health. There's a lot of research that supports that. But the junk food that we put in our mind, of course, also has that impact. And where does the responsibility lie? I heard in America recently that they're now putting KPIs in their managers' targets, that if somebody, for example, in their team is clinically obese, then it's their responsibility to help that person. And it's like, well, that feels wrong, that person, but where does it, because it's a blurry line.
What a great question. And I love your metaphor. Your connection between what's put into our mind and what's not is right on the money. Can I make one or two very quick points about this? Because it is a challenging and complex answer to your question. However, it is absolutely clear that we have to have the conversations about what is individual responsibility and what is it that society or your employer should or might do. However, this conversation often forgets a very simple component, And that is that it's all very well to say that an obese person should, eat differently. That does not take into account the etiology or how they became the way they are, which is a complicated morass of things that are some within their control, some not. But one thing's for certain, the conversation needs to accompany by a recognition that it's hard and that we need to help provide people with the tools and the structures that enable them to make wise choices. And let's, if we pursue your metaphor, labeling food, right, is a really good idea because it enables people to go, oh, I didn't know I was about to consume 4 cups of sugar with that can of soft drink. Well, now we do. So, the same thing applies to mental health. Awareness is important. And then helping provide families, parents and tools. I would hate to be, as I said to you, I'm a new grandpa and I struggle with how am I going to contribute constructively to managing the social media exposure of my grandkids when at the age of 2 they've got iPads and those things are reality. Let's accept that it's complicated and treat it as such, and not fall into that trap of quite banal conversation. Well, you got a choice. Don't put it in your mouth. I think that's actually a borderline cruel and heartless way
100%. 100%, yeah, because we are, so when you do take a whole person approach, and the reason many organizations don't want to do that is because it is complicated. When you look at a whole person, there are so many drivers, and you're touching on addiction and those types of things. And I guess what I've become very aware of is the impact of trauma, because when we were growing up, if a disaster occurred on the other side of the world, you'd hear it on the news, which was to happen twice a day. You'd hear it and it'd be a headline and that was it. Because of course now you can live the story, which again is a good thing.
It's almost live streamed, isn't it?
Live streamed, yeah, or from every angle. And if you're older, you can be more discerning and you can tune in. But if you're younger, as we're saying, you can't be. So before you know it, you're being traumatized all the time, and that
I love your point, and we need to address this as a society because
it's a systemic problem. Yeah,
I mentioned something to someone on this the other day. You know the trick that the media does now, where they will almost live stream something, but then either blur out or stop the video just before the horrible images. But you and I know that there are about to be horrible images, and what happens is at that point we enable people's imaginations to take over. And I'm not sure that's actually, I'm sure the media companies think that, oh, well, we're just preventing exposure to the last gruesome bit of that footage. Well, no, what you're enabling is that the imagination takes over. And what's that full of? Well, it's full of everything else that I've watched on cartoons or movies or anything, which in fact could be worse than the reality. So again, that's a good example of the complication associated. Well, how do you
100%?
manage that?
How do you manage it? And I'll just bring one last point here. Just as I did psychology at university, but then I took that into and had a career in marketing. And of course, the key thing with marketing is you're taught how to get inside someone's mind. I mean, that's the key thing, because once you're inside their mind, of course, you can influence them. And I used to do a lot of presentations to graduates who were thinking about careers in marketing, and they would say, "Isn't marketing manipulation?" And I used to defend it and say, "Of course not." But the truth is, it's double-edged. It can be. In the wrong hands, it can be hugely manipulative. And that's where we've all got to, as employers, take that responsibility to support people to understand, what's in their best interests and what perhaps
it's not helpful to demonize or to bifurcate, to black and white say, well, marketing's bad or whatever, because you're exactly right. All of these things have a continuum of impact, don't they? I mean, public health programs that employ good marketers and people use the same techniques for good rather than evil, as Maxwell Smart would say. And, so it's not helpful to either demonize the media and because they're wrestling with this as much as we are in the mental health space as well. So what's the answer? The answer is good dialogue, role modeling the ability to treat complex things as complex, listening to different perspectives and thinking about, well, and as I've said to you before, Lawrence, mental health has a place for marketers, right? And we don't want the mental health industry, for example, to be dominated or sequestered by the clinicians, for example. And I don't mean to pick on clinicians, but we will get solutions to things like the exposure risk you and I were just talking about through many different inputs into that. Technical people, marketing people, media people, psychology people, psychiatry people. And I think getting the people around the table with those diverse views is really important. One of my fears, to be quite honest with Lawrence, is this space has become unnecessarily political, and I find in some spaces people don't want to talk about it for fear of being cancelled.
Yes, and I can see that.
And it's alive. And I had a doctor, a well-respected medical professional who I think is a great thinker, said, I'm not speaking in public about issues to do with gender. And at a time when we need intelligent, compassionate conversations about gender, what a shame to lose a voice because we become apprehensive
100%.
about being cancelled.
100%. And that is definitely one of the challenges in terms of the political environment. But going back to what you said before, I think the solution has to be collaboration, with all those different voices coming together in a safe environment that can then create something which is very different, because it's diversity and inclusion at play in an area that can really make a difference. I've got two last questions to ask you, because I'm conscious we're coming to the end of our chat. It's gone very quickly. The first question, because I know a lot of people listening to this would be very interested in how you measure impact, because that's a big topic. So there's lots of people, lots of different initiatives. And then the second question, I'll just ask them both at the same time. The second question, which I ask all of my guests, this is called the Finding Equilibrium show, because ultimately we believe that nothing is right, nothing is wrong. Finding balance between the different extremes is what we strive to do, which is not an easy thing to achieve. Sounds easy, but I'd love to know what finding equilibrium means to you. And the second part of that question is what you personally do to support yourself so that you can do the work that you do.
What a lovely couple of questions, right? I'll be quick. The first one, the measurement piece, is not only part of my board plan, but the expectation to come up with some ideas. At the moment, we have a multidimensional way of measuring lag and lead indicators, and we are very clear about what it is we're trying to achieve, which is not happiness. It is not clinical. We don't send out questionnaires about depression and happiness, just to be clear. But we do look at, do people think the systems are in place to provide them the support they need when they need it? Do people feel confident that we are addressing the right psychosocial risks, and do they think that there is a mechanism and a plan to deal with it? Do we provide support in a timely way when people, having brought their whole person to work, need support or assistance for whatever relationship, family, alcohol, whatever it might be? So we focus on those, and then we blend that in with the hard measures of turnover, planned and unplanned absence, workers' compensation claims. And we try to bolt all of that together. And then the last thing we do is we have 10 volunteer working groups around the business that help provide a conduit at a very practical level into the businesses. So there's a network operations working group, there's a retail working group. And I rely heavily on those to gather, collect, and stream feedback back into us that we're doing what we need to do. So that's the measurement.
Awesome.
The piece about balance is really interesting, and it's evolved for me over the years. But the most important thing was to ensure that I had my own head right when it came to issues of accountability and responsibility. And I got there by accident to some extent. And one thing that has been incredibly helpful for me is to go back and be very clear about my own philosophy and approach to how I live my life, which, before anyone wonders where's he going here, is neither perfect nor gets it right every day. And I owe a debt to the Greek philosophers. I am a Stoic at heart. I read Epictetus and recommend Epictetus. And the fundamental concept, it's a bit like there's nothing new in this world when it comes to good mental health, I think.
It's true, 100%.
Getting my head around the fact that I have to do what I can do, contribute where I can, and be clear about what is my responsibility, because otherwise I'm not going to sleep at night and I'm going to end up torturing myself. So a bit of Epictetus, man is not disturbed by events, but by the view he takes of them, is a highly influential philosophy. A little gender balanced for the modern day, but nonetheless, love Epictetus. And the other thing that I do is I make sure now at this stage of my career, I surf when I can. I play basketball 3 times a week, really, really badly. And, my mind sometimes thinks it can do, my body can do things that it can't. But I hang out with a bunch of like-minded old buggers who run around and play basketball and go and have a coffee, and it's good for my brain. And the other thing I do is try and carve out time for my important relationships. And, got a few kids and a few grandkids and a wonderful partner. And those things, making sure that I'm being the best possible partner, father, grandfather, which is an ongoing, interesting challenge. They're the things that I try and do to get some balance in my life.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. It's like it really summarizes and brings a whole conversation together. If you look after your mind, make sure your mind is clear, then everything flows through. And I guess the other big point I got from that was sometimes you've got to look to the past to understand the now and the future, going right back.
Well said. Yep. So, people, when I ask them to read Plato or Epictetus, they come back to me afterwards and go, I don't know why you did that, but now I've read it, I know why you asked.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you so much. Let me acknowledge you, Simon, for all the work that you're doing at Australia Post and your entire career. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Really, really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much, Simon. And thank you for your time and your attention. And we'll see you soon. Bye now.